Hi there, and welcome to part 2 in our current series of how to undertake an independent investigation. I carry on my discussion with Darren Thorne, Managing Director of Facere Melius, so we can discuss how he has recently gone about a really complex independent investigation, and you can learn a little bit more about that process and how they went about it. How do you engage with the patient and their families?
Well, we always try to make contact with the patient or the family as soon as possible as after we've been appointed to introduce the team and to start to talk about the scope of the investigation. So depending on the circumstances, sometimes the patient or the family will have specific questions that they'd like the report to examine. It may not always be possible to provide definitive answers, but we always try and respond explicitly as we can. So, for example, we may create a separate appendix at the back of a report which specifically addresses the questions that we've been asked to look at from the family. And they'll refer back to the main body of the report to provide those answers.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of valuable learning can come from either the patient or the family experience that can be, hugely missed if you only just looked at that one piece of the evidence, which is the clinical records. Those dialogues and conversations are really important, and I think that it can really help them to move on and move forwards and potentially start to hit that process of healing if they feel they've been able to discuss their issues and problems and how they feel, and it's aired and then learned from, because that's the important, it's to take the learning, isn't it?
Absolutely, and we always deal with patients and families really sensitively. We always try to meet with those involved to hear their story as soon as we can, after establishing an outline chronology. And we recognise that for some of these people, describing what happened can be very distressing.
Once you've got all of this information coming in and it's all being distilled into a chronology and we've got lots of evidence underneath it, but how do you quality assure all of that work?
So once we've got a validated clinical picture and we've got our key lines of inquiry, we then move on to create an interview plan. So that's who we want to talk to, what are the key lines we want to ask them, and we use a PEACE framework for our interviews. That is planning, preparation, engage and explain, account, clarify and challenge, and then close and evaluate. So what we're looking to do is we're looking to triangulate what the clinical records say, what the family have told us, the accounts of the clinicians that were involved in delivering the care, the opinion of our clinical advisors against any local or national policy or any relevant legislation. So once the investigator has completed their triangulation, that's when we start to draft the report. So
once you've started to draft the report, how do you develop the recommendations?
We have a strong quality assurance process. Once the report is at its first stage, it will be reviewed by the editorial assurance team. We've got a small group of wordsmiths who have been developed to ensure that we don't make unsubstantiated or indefensible statements. We try really hard to be evidence-based in everything that we say. However, sometimes the evidence to prove or disprove something did or didn't occur is conflicting or just simply isn't there. So in those scenarios, we always make clear that it's the opinion of a clinical expert.
I believe the next stage is the editorial board. Do you want to talk to me about that?
Yeah, so we have a clinical editorial board, and the board has responsibility for checking the evidence, challenging the thinking of the investigator so that we eradicate any unintended or known bias. And the board tend to approve any potentially controversial statements, or we agree a handling strategy. The clinical editorial board is where the unique numbering system really comes into its own, because the board have the ability to dive right into the evidence, and quite often we'll be either doing them virtually, or if we're all in the same room, and one of our team can go straight to the page that something is referenced on, so we can all look at it and examine it. If we think that maybe something has been slightly misunderstood or misrepresented, we can go back and look at that individual page to make our own judgments, and that works really well. The report is then developed into a final draft, and this is where it gets reviewed by the directors of the company and also the wordsmiths again. We aim to write all of our reports in plain English, to make them as accessible to the patients and families as possible. But we're conscious that we walk this tightrope between explaining quite complex clinical concepts using straightforward and accessible terms for a public readership, against providing information to highly qualified clinical readership, so the clinicians. And then we move on to developing recommendations, and that's a real skill. And I'm sure that there are times when we haven't got it quite right, but we always try to make our recommendations smart, but also proportionate and yet impactful. We try not to have too many, so we aim for a maximum of about 25. And we always try to write them in a way that the receiving organisation can make a judgment and interpret a recommendation. And that's because as many documents as we would have looked at, as many people as we would have spoken to within those organisations, there will always be nuances within the organisation that we haven't managed to pick up. So we don't write recommendations that would tell an organisation they need to do sort of very minute operational things. We'll make them strategic enough so that they can be implemented and adopted in the best possible way.
Yeah, and the purpose of these independent investigations is to distill learning from an event that has gone where something's gone wrong. We want to learn from that so we can improve patient care, improve staff experience as well, because often you find with these things, when something's gone wrong, there's a lot of processes that have broken down, or there's staffing issues, or and the staff are not having a great experience, and therefore also the patient isn't having great outcome. And so I think the recommendations being strategic enough that other organizations could pick them up and use them as well, make sure that they're assured against that. So so in your latest investigation, how have you gone about that?
So for our latest investigation, we've published a board assurance tool, and it's about 12 pages, I think, and it introduces the investigation and talks through the key findings, and then it gives some prompts to organisations for other organisations across the NHS to look at and to examine whether or not something like the findings couldn't be occurring in their organisation. So it helps them think through, well, where do we seek assurance? What processes or documents do we need to be looking out for to assure ourselves as a board that the things that were happening in hundreds of miles away in one hospital isn't actually happening in the hospital that we preside over.